Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. We're going straight to the heart of Putin's war machine. Fuel. Overnight on 15th of November 2025, Ukrainian drones hit one of Russia's biggest oil refineries in Ryazan, around 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow. And as Kyiv's generals quietly noted, that wasn't the only target. This was part of a coordinated strike package that also hit a Nebo-U radar system in occupied Crimea, a military train near Tokmak, and Russian troop concentrations near the front. That's according to the Kyiv Independent. Before we dive further into the episode, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Your support at this time is especially gratefully received as we plan our last events of the year, which we'll be recording for the channel, both Silicon Curtain and this channel, with the shorts made available of those interviews, recording on the ground, and potentially running other events in the UK and Europe. At least that's what we would like to do. We can't do it without your support. Now back to the story. You may think it's just another drone attack, but it's also one more turn of the screw in a campaign that is slowly transforming Russia into a petro-state that can't reliably refine its own petrol. Strikes like the one on Ryazan matters because they are reshaping both the Russian economy and the strategic map of the war. Ukraine's general staff put out a terse statement on 15th of November saying Ukrainian forces struck an oil refinery in the Russian city of Ryazan and hit several other military targets. Again, Kyiv Independent. Those other targets included a Nebo-U long-range radar station in occupied Crimea, a military train near Tokmak in occupied Zaporizhia, and a concentration of Russian personnel near Vovchansk in Kharkiv region. That's according to Ukrinform. Russian officials, as usual, tried to spin it away. The defense ministry claimed it had intercepted 64 Ukrainian drones that night across several regions, including 25 over Ryazan Oblast. Ryazan's governor, Pavel Malkov, then delivered the standard damage control narrative. Drones were shot down, everything's under control, nothing to see here, move along, move along. As The Guardian summarized it, he said that falling debris caused a fire on the premises of one enterprise and insisted that air defenses had done their job. That's according to The Guardian. Meanwhile, Ukrainian military channels and local Russian telegram feeds showed a very different reality. Multiple explosions, a large fire at the refinery complex, and a bright glow over the city's industrial zone through the night. Kyiv's line is absolutely clear on this. The General Staff and the state agency Ukrinform described the strike as part of efforts to reduce the enemy's ability to conduct missile and bombing attacks by taking out the Ryazan refinery and high-value military infrastructure. So why is Ryazan a prime target? The Ryazan oil refinery is not some provincial backwater plant, but a core node in Russia's oil export infrastructure. Ukrainian and Russian sources alike describe it as one of Russia's major refining hubs, processing around 13 million tons of crude a year, roughly 5% of total Russian refining throughput, according to earlier industry estimates. That's from Reuters. The General Staff and Ukrinform highlighted that the plant produces a full suite of fuels: gasoline, diesel, liquefied gas, and crucially, around 840,000 tons of TS1 aviation kerosene annually. The fuel that keeps Russia's aerospace forces flying. Again, that's from Ukrinform. Ryazan is not just feeding the Russian budget and civilian cars, but also the bombers that are hitting Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa. In a piece for the Kyiv Post, Julia Strok notes that the Ryazansky refinery is a major producer of jet fuel and TS1 kerosene for the Air Force, and quotes the head of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Magyar Brovdi, bragging that his birds struck a facility that supplies a significant share of Russia's aviation fuel. It was not only Ryazan that was hit, however, in this operation. Other sites targeted include destroyed a Nebo-U radar in Crimea, a high-value early warning system used to track aircraft and some ballistic targets. Ukrainian outlets estimate its value in the tens of millions of dollars. They also hit a military echelon near Tokmak, disrupting Russian logistics in one of the most heavily militarized parts of occupied Zaporizhia. They also struck concentrations of Russian troops near Vovchansk, where Russia has been pressing offensives along the Kharkiv axis, also from Ukrinform. It's also worth noting this is not the first time Ryazan has burnt. Reuters reported a major drone strike on the refinery in January 2025 when a fire and damaged the railway loading racks and processing units forced suspension of loading. That's from Reuters. Jamestown's later analysis on Russia's fuel crisis points out that Ryazan has been hit multiple times in 2025, underlining both the refinery's importance and the persistent gaps in Russian air defense around strategic energy infrastructure. That's Jamestown Foundation reporting. Ukraine's energy demilitarization of Russia continues in an unrelenting wave of operations. So, are drones the sanctions that work the fastest? In October, Reuters published a deep dive into Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy facilities. They calculated that since early August, Ukraine has launched at least 58 attacks on key energy sites, refineries, pumping stations, export terminals, with some drones flying up to 2,000 kilometres into Russian territory. That's from Reuters. A senior Ukrainian government source told Reuters that the goal was straightforward: to create shortages of gasoline and diesel inside Russia. So advancing on the front becomes harder, not just because tanks and trucks need fuel, but because the entire war economy does. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been brutally clear about this. In the same reporting, he describes attacks on Russia's oil sector as the sanctions that work the fastest, faster in many ways than anything the EU bureaucracy can dream up. Analysts at the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, BISI, counted that by early October, 21 of Russia's 38 large refineries had been hit since January 2025. That's about 55% of the sector. They estimate around 20% of Russia's refining capacity has at least temporarily gone offline at some point during this campaign. About 30% of Russia's federal budget comes from oil and gas revenues. If you can degrade the systems that turn crude into saleable fuel, you're decreasing the Kremlin's ability to pay for the war. Ukraine is increasingly doing this with domestically produced long-range drones, systems like Firepoint FP1, Batyar, and others, which means there is no Western political veto over each individual strike. The BISI and Euromaidan Press analysis notes that most deep strike drones hitting Russian territory are now Ukrainian-made, with ranges up to 1,600 kilometers. Add to that reporting via the Financial Times and summarized by Euromaidan Press, the US intelligence has been helping Ukraine select and route strikes on Russian refineries since midsummer, allowing drones to navigate around air defenses and hit high-value units. And you get a picture of a joint Ukrainian-Western strategy, sanctions on paper and drones as the enforcement arm of those sanctions. That's from Euromaidan Press. Well, Russia's fuel crisis, is it a petro-state without petrol? So is the strategy overall working? The short answer is yes. The big contention, of course, is speed and impact. A recent Washington Post analysis described how Ukrainian drone attacks have left nearly 40% of Russia's refining capacity idle at certain points, responsible as well for around 70% of refineries shutdowns nationwide. They estimate a domestic gasoline shortage of roughly 400,000 tonnes a month. That's about 20% of total demand, forcing Russia to ramp up imports from Belarus and elsewhere. Open source researchers tracked fuel shortages in at least 30 plus regions, with especially severe rationing in annexed Crimea and some remote areas. That's from Euromaidan Press. On top of that, Russia has been forced to ban or restrict exports of gasoline and diesel repeatedly this year, sacrificing lucrative foreign currency earnings to keep domestic pumps and military fuel depots supplied. Again, that is Bloomsbury Intelligence Institute. You can see the cumulative effect in the macroeconomic numbers too. Fuel prices rising in Russia by over 10% this year, a growing budget deficit projected at around 2.5 to 3% of GDP, and creeping tax hikes, plus cuts to social spending to plug the gap. Washington Post. The International Energy Agency, quoted by Euromaidan Press, doesn't think that Russian refining will fully recover before mid-2026 because each new wave of Ukrainian strikes undoes months of repair work and forces refineries to run in suboptimal ways, well below their capacity. That's Euromaidan Press. Jamestown Foundation summed up the paradox neatly. Russia is at risk of becoming a gas station without gasoline. Lots of crude, but a battered, increasingly fragile system to turn it into usable fuel for civilians and soldiers alike. So how much does this actually hurt the army, though? Now, there is a counter-argument, mostly pushed by Moscow and some cautious Western analysts. They point out that Russia has spare fuel refining capacity and a heavily centralized, state-directed energy sector. A Reuters-based analysis covered by Medusa notes that despite this barrage of strikes, overall oil processing has officially fallen by about only 3% this year, far less, I think, than most are expecting. Refineries have shuffled production, tapped idle units, and raced to repair damaged facilities, according to Reuters. These figures, of course, are difficult to corroborate, but nonetheless, they will worry Ukraine. If total refining output is down by only a few percent, is the campaign worth it? Well, in Russia, the military is prioritized. Fuel for the army, air force, and security services is protected first and above everything else. The pain is pushed on to civilians and exporters. Petrol queues, regional rationing, export bans, and lost hard currency revenues are the result, according to Euromaidan Press. Lower revenues from oil export, taxes, consumption, etc., lower economic activity, this all translates into fewer missiles and bombs, which Russia can afford to buy to hit Ukraine, and less money for military recruitment bonuses. There's also an operational effect that doesn't show up immediately in the output graphs. Logistics become more complicated. Fuel must be moved further by more vulnerable routes from fewer surviving hubs. Stockpiles become more brittle. A single well-timed strike in a pipeline or a depot can have outsized impact because there's less redundancy in the system. You saw this with the recent Ukrainian strike on the Koltsovoy fuel pipeline near Moscow, which Ukrainian intelligence said destroyed all three parallel lines and disrupted flows of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Kiev's military intelligence chief Kirill Budanov claimed that this single operation did more than many rounds of international sanctions to put limits on Russia. That's according to AP News. Add that pipeline attack to the Ryazan refinery hit, the Nebo-U radar knockout, and earlier blows to the Shekharis oil terminal in Novorossiysk, which temporarily halted around 2% of global oil shipments from Russia, and you see the strategy: turn Russia's war into a logistics nightmare and make energy the weak point, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Well, this reporting is from Kyiv Post. Well, let's wind this episode down, focusing on escalation, legitimacy, and what the West should do. Of course, every time Ukraine hits deep inside Russia, the escalation debate flares up again in certain portions of Western capitals. Let's be blunt, Russia has spent nearly 4 years levelling Ukraine's power grid, heating plants, dams, hospitals, and apartment blocks. Its latest mass strike on Kyiv killed civilians, including the widow of the first victim of the Chernobyl disaster. It is a brutal and symbolic reminder of who is targeting whom, that Russia is the aggressor. So says Kyiv Independent. Ukraine, by contrast, is hitting oil refineries that make jet fuel for bombers, radar systems that guide missiles, fuel pipelines that supply invasion forces, military trains and troop concentrations in occupied territory. These are legitimate military targets under international law, the rules of war, and even humanitarian law. They are the definition of dual use infrastructure that directly sustains Putin's aggressive war machine. Yet much of Europe and the US political class still get visibly nervous when Ukrainian drones blow up a Russian refinery, while remaining strangely passive when Russian missiles blow up a Ukrainian power plant. Meanwhile, US and European policy is already halfway in. Intelligence support has been flowing. Sanctions increasingly focus on Russia's energy complex. This has the outlines of a united strategy, and Western officials quietly acknowledge that degrading Russia's oil revenues is one of the very few ways to change Putin's cost-benefit calculus, possibly the only way. That's according to Euromaidan Press, because every time a refinery like Ryazan burns or a radar like Nebo-U goes dark, Moscow's ability to terrorize Ukrainian civilians and sustain offensive operations shrinks, even if the effect is incremental rather than spectacular. There is no silver bullet, but the impact of each strike accumulates, bringing Putin's regime closer to collapse and an end to his endless aggression.